it's worthwhile us just going into the history for maybe 2 or 3 minutes of how we got into this mess to then determine where we are presently and how it may play out in the coming years. Really, real estate values have been rising significantly since about 2006. And when I say significantly, I mean greatly above Canadian incomes, to the point where you now need 12, 15 times whatever it is Canadian income in order to afford a basic house. And so prices have largely divorced themselves from Canadian incomes. Fine, that's a reality that we all knew about. But that reality existed in 2012 as much as it did in 2021, maybe not to the same degree, but there it did. Having said that, this was all put on steroids, really post-COVID in particular. 2019 saw the government acting scared, and the M2 money supply increased by 25%, which means in English that 25% of the dollars that were just basically made, there was quantitative production of dollars such that suddenly Canadians were sitting on 25% more cash than they had the year before in aggregate. And Canadians and being fairly conservative, we don't have an incredibly dynamic economy as compared to the States, chose to put it into real estate. And it pushed up asset values massively. The easiest place to invest in real estate is, of course, new build construction. And as a result, the bubble was most acute in new build construction, and particularly condos, where builders were only able to make things pencil by putting ever smaller projects together, such that you have things like the Good and other condos that basically sold with 320, 330 square feet, which is just an unlivable amount of space for anything more than perhaps a single student storing a set of skis. And so we entered into a scenario where prices were totally and utterly insane, approaching $1,400, $1,500, $1,600 a square foot in metropolitan areas like Toronto as we kind of hit the 2022 mark. And of course, it didn't stop people from buying them. Taxes on it were huge as well. Government were kind of pushers in this scenario where at the end of the day, they raised development fees to the roof, forced builders to produce ever smaller products to make these things pencil. And these prices were required, but the prices were never functionally grounded in reality because they were always massively divorced from income. And the only reason that they continued afoot, the only reason that really from 2017 onward that anything sold was because everyone kind of recognized that they could take advantage of the bubble that had been created. And again, the thing about a bubble is you can make a lot of money in a bubble as long as you get out beforehand. So everyone was basically saying, I don't really care what the cash flow fundamentals of this property are. Even if I lose money, I'm going to sell it for a capital gain. And if I get that capital gain, then I come out a winner. And real estate hasn't crashed in 20 years. Why would it crash now? And so we had a bunch of amount of people who kind of went in, and the vast majority of product and the height of bubble really took place after the M2 money supply went nuts. So 2020, 2021, 2022, which is when things started to turn. Now, you may wonder, why did I go into this history? What was the point? Well, the reason I went into the history is because the only way we are going to get out of it is by understanding that history. Because after all, the construction time of a condo is 5 years, 5 to 6 years. What that means is that the product from 2020 is finally hitting the market. That is to say, people are now being forced to crystallize on the purchase price that they signed for in 2020. Next year, it'll be 2021, and the year after that, it'll be 2022. In other words, it's going to get worse before it gets better because the product and the condos that are closing today have ever higher prices as we approach the 2020-22 condo signing period. And there are more and more people who are looking at the basic math and saying, I don't want any part of this. I'm leaving. I'm not concluding my deal. And that brings us to the present day. So we've dealt with the past, we're going to deal with the present day, and then we'll talk about the future. Present day, where are we? Well, we're in a scenario where there's a whole bunch of condos that are closing now at $1,400 or $1,500 a square. They come across my desk every single day. But the market value for those products are $900 to $1,000. Now, if you think about it, usually, if a builder is anywhere near decent, they've taken a 20% deposit. But even with that $20,000 deposit, if say you bought $1 million condo, you've put down 20%, that's $800,000. you're still going to be underwater by $150,000 if you close. And crystallizing the loss that way is often palatable to people. And that is the reason that about 25% of people who are closing these products are now walking away. Now, that's not a stat that is being published by the builders. Obviously, it's not in their interest to publish it. In fact, it's largely anecdotal. But I do have it on decent authority that that's the way, that's what the numbers are.